The Promise versus the Shelf, the 2000 Dilemma. Welcome to a deep dive into the American wallet. As the Trump administration kicks off its nationwide affordability tour, a central question looms over every kitchen table. Can a $2,000 check truly outrun the rising cost of daily life? President Donald J. Trump has utilized platforms like Truth Social to promise a dividend of at least $2,000 per person for low and middle income citizens, funded by what he describes as trillions of dollars in new tariff revenue. However, the math is meeting reality at the retail checkout counter. Data-driven reports indicate that the nation's largest retailers, Amazon, Target, and Walmart, have already begun adjusting prices in response to the shifting trade landscape. While Walmart and Target have stated they will do everything possible to keep prices low as a last resort, Amazon has reportedly seen price increases of up to 5.7% through late 2025. For a low-income household, the $2,000 influx of cash is intended to provide a financial cushion. Yet, as shelf prices for essentials like milk, bread, and medicine threaten to surge before these checks even reach mailboxes, the risk is that the dividend will be swallowed by inflation before it can be spent. Economists note that while the dividend could potentially transform regressive tariffs into a progressive policy, the execution remains entangled in a web of legislative hurdles and supply chain volatility. We are tracking the raw numbers to see if American families are gaining ground or simply running in place. The retail frontline. How giants are responding. As the new tariff landscape takes shape, America's retail giants are signaling a shift in pricing strategy that directly affects every household budget. Reports from late 2025 indicate that Amazon, Target, and Walmart have already begun raising prices in response to these trade policies. Data from third-party research firm DataWeave shows that Amazon led the pack with a price increase of 5.7% through September, while Target and Walmart saw more modest rises of 1.7%. While Walmart and Target emphasize that price hikes are a last resort to protect their scale, Amazon's marketplace is uniquely vulnerable. This vulnerability stems from the platform's heavy reliance on third-party sellers, many of whom are small businesses lacking the inventory flexibility or private label leverage of their larger competitors. Consequently, these smaller sellers are far more exposed to tariff-driven cost increases, often being forced to pass those costs directly to the consumer. Furthermore, economists estimate that consumers will ultimately bear more than 50% of the total cost of these U.S. tariffs, a significant jump from the 22% observed at mid-year. This retail reality creates a race against time. Will the promised $2,000 dividend arrive before these cumulative shelf price increases neutralize its value? As companies navigate this crossfire, 9 in 10 goods firms have already adjusted their price tags, leaving families to bridge the gap in the interim. Tracking the numbers, CPI, and the cost of basics. To understand if a $2,000 dividend is sufficient, we must look at the official data on what Americans are actually paying. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that consumer prices rose 2.4% over the year ended January 2026. While this headline number suggests relative stability, the devil is in the details of essential goods. Food prices increased by an overall 2.9% during that same period. Specifically, the cost of food away from home jumped by 4.0%, while cereals and bakery products, staples of the American diet, rose by 3.1%. Other daily necessities saw even sharper spikes, with personal care products increasing by 5.4% and household furnishings rising by 3.9%. Energy costs presented a mixed bag. Electricity prices surged by 6.3% and natural gas by 9.8%, though these were partially offset by a 7.5% drop in gasoline prices. For a low-income household, these specific increases in electricity and bread are far more impactful than a general inflation average. The $2,000 dividend is intended to act as a shield, but with essential services like shelter also climbing by 3.0%, the protective layer is thinning. The math suggests that for many, the dividend isn't extra cash. It's a survival fund just to keep the lights on and the pantry full. The $2,000 promise trumps tariff dividend logic. The centerpiece of the administration's economic strategy is a bold, albeit controversial, redistribution plan. President Donald J. Trump has utilized social media to promise a dividend of at least $2,000 per person for low and middle-income citizens. The president frames this not as a government handout, but as a dividend funded by what he claims are trillions of dollars in newly collected tariff revenue. People that are against tariffs are fools, the president stated in a November Truth Social post, arguing that these collections will simultaneously pay down the $37 trillion national debt and provide direct relief to everyone, excluding high-income individuals. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has elaborated that this dividend could manifest in various forms beyond a simple check, potentially including significant tax deductions. These might include the elimination of taxes on tips, overtime, and Social Security, or the deductibility of auto loans. The administration's affordability tour aims to sell this vision of record investment and a revitalized Main Street. However, the shift from a proposed little rebate to a firm $2,000 promise has put intense pressure on federal math. As the administration equates these payments to a share of national success, the question remains whether the revenue generated by an 18% average tariff rate, the highest since 1934, can actually fund such a massive payout. The math gap: revenue versus repayment. While the vision of a $2,000 dividend is politically powerful, economic analysts are raising alarms about the fundamental math behind the payout. The Trump administration has collected $309.2 billion in tariff revenue through October 2025, a sharp increase from the $165.4 billion collected during the same period in 2024. However, even this record-breaking surge may fall short of the dividend's requirements. Erica York of the Tax Foundation estimates that providing $2,000 to approximately 150 million adults earning under $100,000 would cost nearly $300 billion annually. If the program includes children, as some have suggested, the cost could skyrocket to $600 billion per year. This creates a glaring funding gap between the projected $200 billion in annual tariff revenue and the massive cost of the dividend. Furthermore, the administration has already committed this same revenue to other priorities, including paying down the $37 trillion national debt and offsetting the cost of previous tax cuts. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has emphasized a laser focus on debt reduction, leading experts to question how the same dollar can be spent twice. With current tariffs already costing the average household between $1,600 and $2,600 a year, the dividend might simply be a case of returning money that was already taken at the border. Poverty and purchasing power: the direct burden. The impact of tariffs isn't just a macroeconomic statistic. It is a life-altering reality for the most vulnerable Americans. Because tariffs act as an indirect tax, they immediately reduce the purchasing power of household incomes. The Yale Budget Lab estimates that the new 2025 tariffs will push between 650,000 and 875,000 additional Americans into poverty. This represents a 0.2 to 0.3% increase in the U.S. population living below the poverty line, depending on the metric used. Under the official poverty measure, which compares cash income to an inflation index threshold, the poverty rate is projected to rise from 10.4 to 10.7%. Children are particularly at risk, with approximately 375,000 more minors expected to fall into poverty as tariff-driven price hikes increase the cost of basic living. While the $2,000 dividend could technically transform these tariffs into a progressive policy, the dividend has not yet been approved, leaving families to face higher prices today with only the hope of a check tomorrow. For those on the brink, the 2.1% increase in the CPIU threshold means that even with cost of living adjustments for Social Security and SNAP, the real value of their resources is being eroded. The Main Street policy is currently a Main Street burden for those who can least afford it. The Silver Tsunami: impact on older taxpayers. As we examine the distribution of this new financial burden, a specific demographic emerges as uniquely vulnerable: older Americans. While overall, taxpayers aged 65 and older will see their tax burdens rise by nearly 1/800, slightly less than the general population, this average masks a harsher reality for those with low incomes. In the bottom income quintile, Older taxpayers will experience a 2.2 percentage point increase in their federal tax rate, which is higher than the 1.9% increase for the general population and 1.6% for families with children. This fixed income trap occurs because a larger portion of their modest spending goes toward goods and services directly impacted by tariffs and the resulting inflation. For a senior living on Social Security, a $20,100 average increase in the federal tax burden in 2026 is a devastating blow to their after-tax income, which is projected to drop by 2.0% across all families. The proposed $2,000 dividend is marketed as a flat per-person payout that could more than cover these costs, but the timing is critical. If the check arrives in late 2026, many seniors will have already spent 18 months choosing between medicine and heat. The administration's plan has the potential to turn a regressive tax into a progressive one. But for the silver tsunami on fixed incomes, the transition is fraught with immediate peril. Marketplace wars, small sellers versus big box, scale. The retail landscape is currently divided between those who can absorb the tariff shock and those who cannot. Large retailers like Walmart and Target possess private label leverage and scale that allow them to negotiate with suppliers or temporarily hold prices steady. Walmart has publicly stated they will do everything possible to keep prices low for as long as possible. In contrast, third-party sellers on platforms like Amazon are far more exposed to tariff-driven cost increases. Guru Hariharan, CEO of Commerce IQ, notes that these smaller enterprises lack the inventory flexibility and private label options of their larger rivals. This creates a tiered pricing reality. While a name brand item at Target might stay at $20, the same item from a small business seller on Amazon might jump to $24 to cover new 10% or 25% duties. Furthermore, 9 in 10 goods firms among mid-market companies have already reported raising prices. Amazon's spokesperson argues that prices are always fluctuating and that they remain competitive. But data from DataWeave shows Amazon's prices rising nearly 3 times faster than Walmart's. For the consumer, this means the $2,000 dividend will go much further at a big box store than it will when supporting small independent online sellers, ironically hurting the very Main Street entrepreneurs the policy aims to protect. The global echo, OECD forecasts and uncertainty. The ripple effects of the U.S. tariff policy are extending far beyond American borders, reshaping the global economic outlook. The OECD has downgraded its global growth projections, forecasting a decline from 3.3% in 2024 to a modest 2.9% in 2025 and 2026. This slowdown is most concentrated in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, where output growth is expected to hit just 1.1% in the U.S. by late 2025. Protectionism is adding to inflationary pressures worldwide, making it take longer for inflation to reach central bank targets. OECD chief economist Alvaro Pereira notes that trade policy uncertainty is at an all-time high, negatively impacting both business and consumer confidence. While global headline inflation is expected to moderate to 3.2% in 2026, the United States is a key exception, with inflation expected to rise to nearly 4% by end 2025 and remain above target throughout 2026. This global, challenging, and uncertain environment means that the $2,000 dividend is being issued in a climate where global trade growth is likely to slow substantially. American families are not just dealing with domestic price hikes, but with a global supply chain that is slowing down and becoming more expensive at every link. Logistics in flux, container prices, and front-loading. Behind every price tag is a journey across the ocean, and that journey is becoming increasingly volatile. Merchandise trade volumes rose strongly in early 2025, driven by front-loading as exporters rushed to beat the implementation of new tariffs. This surge was most apparent in industrial supplies, including steel, aluminum, and pharmaceutical goods. However, this temporary boom has been followed by a sharp correction. Global container prices in April 2025 were 40% lower than at the start of the year, as the initial rush subsided and trade activity weakened. Routes between Shanghai and the United States have been particularly volatile, experiencing sharp declines upon the introduction of tariffs, followed by a 30% rebound after recent policy adjustments. Despite this volatility, shipping rates remain 30% lower than at the end of 2024, reflecting a broader cooling of global demand. This instability in logistics costs adds another layer of uncertainty for retailers. When a container price fluctuates by 30–40% in a few months, businesses find it impossible to predict their final landed costs. For the consumer, this means that even if a $2,000 dividend is paid, the hidden tax of shipping volatility will continue to show up in the price of everything from sneakers to smartphones. The White House surcharge, a 150-day temporary shock. In a historic move to address international payments problems, the White House issued a proclamation imposing a 10% temporary import surcharge on all articles imported into the United States. Effective February 24, 2026, this surcharge is intended to deal with what the administration describes as a large and serious balance of payments deficit, which reached $1.2 trillion in 2025. While certain critical minerals, energy products, and essential agricultural items like beef and tomatoes are currently exempt, the vast majority of consumer goods are now subject to this added cost. This 150-day temporary window is designed to exert maximum leverage in trade negotiations, but it also creates an immediate 10% price floor for retailers. President Trump finds that these fundamental payments problems significantly harm national interests and that special measures are required to protect the dollar. However, the 10% surcharge is applied in addition to any other existing duties, potentially pushing the effective rate on some goods above 35%. For American families, this temporary measure acts as a sudden, sharp inflation shock, precisely when the first dividend checks were expected to arrive. The administration views this as a necessary golden age realignment, but for households, it is an immediate 10% tax on the global marketplace. The Capitol Hill hurdle. Will Congress act? The most significant barrier to the $2,000 dividend is not the trade revenue itself, but the legislative reality of Washington, D.C. Despite the president's social media pledges, a $2,000 check in the form of a direct payment requires explicit congressional approval. Lawmakers have already shown hesitation when the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was approved. It did not include a tariff dividend, despite members having the opportunity to add one. Currently, tariff offsets have not been a priority for many lawmakers, who are instead focused on using the revenue for deficit reduction or the extension of existing tax cuts. Senator Josh Hawley introduced legislation to provide $600 tariff rebate checks to adults and children, but that bill has not yet advanced, signaling a lack of appetite for direct cash stimulus. Fiscal conservatives remain concerned about the $38 trillion national debt and argue that injecting hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy could worsen inflation. This creates a political stalemate. The administration promises a dividend it cannot unilaterally issue, while Congress remains divided on whether the money should go to the people or the deficit. For the average citizen, this means the $2,000 payment is currently a proposed policy, not a passed law, with no official forms or IRS guidance yet available. The legal battle, Supreme Court, and the power to tax. As Congress debates the spending, the very legality of the revenue source is under fire in the nation's highest court. The U.S. Supreme Court recently heard oral arguments regarding whether the president has the authority to unilaterally impose these tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This legal challenge is a make-or-break moment for the dividend plan. If the justices rule against the administration as much as 75% of the projected tariff revenue, the very source of the $2,000 dividend would simply vanish. Businesses are challenging the administration's use of emergency powers, arguing that such massive trade barriers require an act of Congress. The uncertainty created by this case has a chilling effect on the economy. Frequent changes to tariff rates and the possibility of a total judicial reversal make it nearly impossible for retailers to set long-term prices. Furthermore, the Supreme Court's decision will determine whether the current 18% average rate is a permanent fixture or a temporary overreach. For the American consumer, this means that the $2,000 promise is resting on a fragile legal foundation. A ruling against the president would leave households with the burden of the previous year's price hikes, but no hope for a future dividend to offset them. The debt versus relief dilemma. Trump's balancing act. The Trump administration is currently attempting a precarious financial balancing act, paying down the past while subsidizing the present. On one hand, President Trump and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent are laser-focused on reducing the $37 trillion national debt, promising that tariff revenue will bring down the deficit to GDP ratio. On the other hand, the $2,000 dividend proposal aims to inject hundreds of billions into U.S. households to combat the rising cost of living. Critics argue these two goals are mutually exclusive. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget projects that the dividend could cost $600 billion, while the entire tariff program is only expected to generate around $200 billion to $300 billion in annual revenue. This leaves a massive hole that would likely be filled by, ironically, more debt. Economists warn that injecting $2,000 per person could further fuel inflation, as increased demand without an increase in supply leads to even higher retail prices. This stimulus trap could result in a negative market response, increasing interest rates and making loans more expensive for the very people the dividend is supposed to help. The administration frames this as a Main Street victory, but if the math leads to higher debt and higher inflation, the $2,000 dividend may ultimately cost more than it pays. The final verdict: winners, losers, and the break-even point. As we reach the final calculation, the $2,000 tariff dividend reveals itself as a high-stakes experiment in social and economic engineering. On paper, the combined policy of tariffs and dividends could actually reduce average taxes for the lowest income quintile by about $2,300 per family. This would effectively transform a regressive tariff into a progressive lifeline, but only for those at the very bottom. For the middle class and higher income families, the story changes. Those in the top quintile could see their taxes increase by $2,000, while the top 1% faces an average hike of nearly $40,000. The net effect on the U.S. Treasury is a loss of $4.7 trillion over the next decade, a cost that will likely be passed to future generations. For the average family today, the $2,800 average tariff burden in 2026 is a near-perfect mirror of the $2,000 proposed dividend, meaning most will simply break even while navigating significantly higher shelf prices for milk, bread, and medicine. The dividend check, if it ever arrives, isn't a windfall. It's an 18% surcharge refund. Whether this influx of cash can outrun the 4.0% surge in food and energy costs remains the central question of the American wallet. In the end, the $2,000 dividend isn't just about covering rising costs. It's about deciding who pays for the golden age of American trade.